So what you want to do is reduce your exposure to risk. You want to reduce your exposure to harm. You want to be ready to cope with bad case or worst case scenarios. That basically at the end of the day is common sense. That is not left or right, that is common sense. So I would say to people, don't get too hung up on exact predictions or wanting to know exactly whether the science is 100% reliable. Think about what is a sensible kind of prudent way to move into the difficult, uncertain world that is arising.
Hi, Rupert. Morning. How are
you? I'm doing all right, thank you. I'm a bit hot on this very hot April day, but I'm enjoying it as much as I can.
And thank you for your patience in making the show. You'll hear in my voice, and people have heard the last couple of episodes, I'm still a bit croaky, but it's good to find.
Probably sounds sexy to some listeners.
Hopefully, but I don't think my girlfriend thinks so. But no, it's been a month now. But anyway, here we are. Okay, let me set the scene for this conversation and why I wanted to talk to you. As you know, I'm a conservative, but I'm not an ideological conservative. I just have certain traditional conservative values. There is a body of work, people, scientists, who for a long time have been sounding the alarm with regards to climate change.
Yeah.
More recently, there's been a growing body of people, politicians, experts, some scientists who are starting to contradict some of that thinking, some of those thoughts, specifically with regards to, say, whether net zero is worth it. And some people actually challenging some of the science. Somebody like me sits in the middle of that and says, I just want to know the truth. What is going on? What is happening? What is the science? What do we know? What should we be doing? What shouldn't we be doing because it's ultimately detrimental to society?
Yeah.
But specifically, that net zero thing does come up a lot. So that's an area where I definitely want to get into with you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you are somebody who's been in the trenches for a long time. You're a philosopher. You're a writer. So I thought it would be good to have you on. Now, I will warn you, it's a very conservative audience. There will be some people who will switch off immediately, or every time you try and explain something, they'll be smashing the comments and angry that you're here. But I'm really glad to meet you. I'm totally curious to understand from you what is happening, because there is this growing weight and body of people who are pushing back against the climate change narrative that we've had for a good few decades now. So set the scene for me.
Yeah. All right, well, let's start with this. Climate change is not woke, right?
Okay.
You can have whatever opinion you like on issues of, say, identity politics, right? Why does the right talk so much about identity politics? Because they know that they're onto something. They know that the left is in trouble on this issue, and that the left has arguably gone up a blind alley on it. And that, by the way, is my view as well. In the Climate Majority Project that I run, our starting point is to say whether you are pro-gender critical views on feminism or against them, whether you think that the diversity and inclusion agenda has gone too far or you think it hasn't gone far enough, whatever views you have on these things have basically nothing to do with the question of the climate. The question of the climate is at its foundation a question of sheer hard fact. You mentioned dissent among scientists. So look, putting my philosopher of science hat on for a moment, if there isn't anything to disagree about vis-a-vis a scientific question, it's not a scientific question, right? Science is what has an open research frontier. But in terms of the research frontier on climate science, it's not about whether or not it's happening. It's about how bad it is, and it's about exactly how much we know about it. And so, yeah, of course there is uncertainty around climate science. If there wasn't, it wouldn't be science, right? People wouldn't still be finding stuff out. But uncertainty is not our friend here. The question is it going to be as bad as the scientists are mostly saying, or is it going to be less bad, or is it going to be worse? And let me tell you something, Peter, about the interactions I have with scientists about this. Scientists, climate scientists and ecologists, are sometimes accused of being alarmists, but But the truth is, if anything, the opposite. So I get to spend quite a bit of time talking with scientists about the climate, etc., in private, not just in public, but in private. I get to have a drink with them, have a beer with them, have a cup of tea with them. What do they say in those kinds of settings? I'll tell you what they say. They always say that what they actually think is that it's worse than what they're saying in their papers. Not that it's probably better, not that anyone's exaggerating, but it's probably worse. Why is that? So again, coming at this from a philosophy of science perspective, the reason is not hard to understand. Scientists are naturally conservative creatures, right? They don't like to put anything out there that they can't cop a bottom. What they think is going on and what they fear is even worse than what they typically say in their papers. They basically only say in their papers what they can prove, because the worst thing for a scientist is having been shown to be wrong. So in terms of what we're facing, the probability is that what we're facing is not less bad than what we hear from the scientists. The probability is that it is worse. And there are various kinds of tipping points and kind of wild possibilities of what could happen, which we should be seriously concerned about. For example, in this country, the army are concerned about the possibility of a really kind of bizarre sounding tipping point happening, totally contrary to what you might expect in a world that is gradually overheating as our world is. Namely, that this overheating is, of course, melting the ice caps. And as you melt the Arctic ice cap, you release a load of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic. And as you do that, you disrupt ocean currents. And we're getting increasing evidence that what we call the Gulf Stream is being disrupted, right? And as we all know in this country, the Gulf Stream is the reason why we have such a temperate climate in this country, right? You compare us to places on a similar latitude in North America, they're freezing for most of the year. So there's this savage kind of irony that one possibility, we don't know if this is going to happen, but one possibility that we need to be prepared for, and the army are getting more concerned about it in this country, is that global overheating could unleash a local cooling, possibly a very severe cooling, around the Atlantic basin. Countries like the UK and even worse, Scandinavia, could end up being thrown into a climate that is way colder than we currently have because of global overheating. It sounds mad, but you see the logic of it. It's actually quite simple. You melt that ice, you disrupt the Gulf Stream, suddenly Britain doesn't have such a temperate climate anymore. That could happen. So this is an example of how the scientists that I know and who I get to speak to off the record, what they typically say is things are probably actually worse than you think. Now, let's take this back to politics for a second. Why should conservative people be concerned about this? Well, in my experience, conservative people are often concerned, funnily enough, about conserving things, right? They want some features of the status quo to persist. They want conservation in relation to nature. They want conservation in relation to heritage. They don't want everything to be upended. If we don't get a better handle on the climate situation, everything is going to be upended. We face a choice now between different kinds of, frankly, challenging futures. And if we're going to reduce our exposure and reduce our risk, which is the sensible, pragmatic, I would say conservative thing to do, then we're going to have to make some significant policy changes in order to head off those kinds of dangerous possible futures which will otherwise come. So concern about climate change is not woke. It is just basic, pragmatic common sense. And what we're trying to do in the organization I run, which is called the Climate Majority Project, is to turn this into a basis for bringing people together across the political spectrum. It's crazy that people on the left have thought that they can somehow own the climate issue. This is an issue for all of us. Margaret Thatcher, for example, was, of course, way ahead of her time on this. She gave groundbreaking speeches in the late 1980s about her concerns about global overheating. That concern should be persisting and growing now because the situation now is a lot more serious than it was in the late 1980s. And that's why in the Climate Majority Project, we have, for example, Thatcherites who are on board with us, as well as Greens and left-wingers and whatever, because these are people who get it, that if you care about conserving what you have, we need to care about the climate threat.
My gut feel is a couple of decades ago, 20 years ago, that there was pretty much bipartisan agreement that we face risks from climate change. My gut feel is that. And I'm also aware over the last kind of decade, 15 years, that there has been a splintering in politics to very divisive issues. And I suspect social media played a role in this.
Yes.
I suspect the fragmentation of media played a role in this. And that media itself became a little bit more ideological. And so you kind of picked a team, a red team, a blue team.
Yeah.
And we've gone from a place of this kind of bipartisan agreement that climate change was a risk to it essentially being the left who have continued to support the issues of climate change, to the right starting to push back.
Yeah.
And I say this, knowing that there are lobbyists, knowing there are people with deep financial interests with keeping certain industries alive.
Yep.
And we've seen they've done this previously with smoking and guns and whatever issue, not just here in America. And so I sit across from you knowing that these people exist, that have these deep financial interests in creating what they consider information, others may consider disinformation. But I'm also aware that we're in a world of global propaganda, and there are governments trying to influence other governments. And if you want to get an economic advantage, that you may want to finance deep fear about climate change in other countries as well. So there's this wall of propaganda coming from all directions, wall of information to others from all different directions. But we have gone from what I thought was bipartisan agreement on this to now a real ideological split. Have you tracked that change in?
Sure.
And where do you think that comes from?
So it's a complicated picture. You've indicated some of the complications. I would add a further complication that I think that while you're right that in some quarters there has been a pushback against climate reality, as I would see it, in recent years, in other quarters there has been more of an accommodation with it. So look, for example, at the changing position of Nigel Farage on this. So he's somebody who used to be an outright climate denier. Now, he's still not exactly buying into some of the stuff that I laid out a few minutes ago. He's still quite a long way off acknowledging some of the basic science even around the situation. But he's not tending to be an outright climate denier anymore. What he tends to do nowadays is to say, well, maybe what we need to do is question the advantages of net zero and question the costs of action on climate change. So in the technical lingo, he would now be called not a climate denier, but a climate delayer. He's in favor of delaying action that is costly on climate. He wanted me for years to come on his show on telly and on radio, and I always said no because I don't debate with full-on climate deniers. I think that's pointless and absurd. They're not full-on climate deniers. I'm not really interested in the truth. I'm interested in talking to the people out there who are open-minded about this, right? Now, he's become more open-minded about it. And once he became more open-minded about it, I agreed to go on his show. And we argued about net zero, and we argued about adaptation and so on and so forth. He now accepts that there is dangerous climate change happening, and he accepts that some of it is human caused. Now, that's progress. It's not arriving at exactly where we need to be, but it is progress. Similarly, if you look at the scientific consensus, people used to quote this figure of 97%. But that figure is out of date now. The
97% of scientists.
Yeah, 97% of scientists were supposed to. You could put that up on the screen if you want. 97% of scientists were supposed to be believers in dangerous climate change, but it's not that. That's an out of date figure now. The figure now is more like 99.8%.
Okay.
It's
who are the 2.2?
Well, it's there's one or two minuscule contrarians. Like I say, in any live and open science, there are going to be dissenters. You just look back at the history of theory around continental drift or fundamental physics or anything, right? This is the way that it goes. But the consensus now is very, very tight. So that's one key point to make. In terms of what's happened around conservative politics here, I think some people have seen an opportunity to make short-term gains. It's important, though, to be clear that there continue to be many conservatives, I mean with a small c and a large c, who are fully in favor of climate action. And in the Climate Majority Project, we work with those people. So I'm just going to reel off a list of names of who those people are. So in this country, we've got Ben Goldsmith, Zach Goldsmith, Lord Randall, that's Theresa May's former environment advisor, Lord Deben, who was the Climate Change Committee head, Claire Phillips, who was the Conservative Climate Change Minister, Amber Rudd, the former Conservative Home Secretary, came on our podcast, our webinar recently, and spoke with us. She's very keen on what we're doing. Even Michael Gove, Rory Stewart, these people are in favour of what we're doing. In America, you've got Bob Inglis, who's a fascinating character. He's a former congressman, a Republican, born-again Christian, evangelical, very conservative on social issues, but serious on the climate agenda, and obviously completely opposed to what Donald Trump is doing on climate, which is really, frankly, really awful. Maybe we'll get to talk about that. One thing important to note about Donald Trump, he's still building higher seawalls around his golf courses. So the reality is he knows that it's actually happening. He just pretends that it's not. And this is what a lot of these so-called conservative politicians do, because he thinks he can get short-term electoral advantage out of it, because the question of net zero, etc., has been weaponized. Now, we could talk about net zero more, but one thing I want to straight away move to is to say that's one reason why in the Climate Majority Project, we try not to start the conversation with net zero, which has been weaponized and polarized. We say, let's start from looking at climate impacts. And climate impacts are getting worse. Every year they're getting worse. And basically every sane person on the planet knows this. Everyone in Valencia knows it very well. Everyone in Los Angeles knows it very well. But you don't have to live in those places. Look at the flooding that overtook this country last year. And as we're talking this week in this country, the Climate Change Committee, which is a neutral quasi-governmental body, we're mainly composed of scientists. The Climate Change Committee said Britain is horribly underprepared for the climate impacts that are coming. If we don't start preparing, then by 2050, a quarter of our houses and half of our roads and railways will be vulnerable to flooding. Now, when you start with impacts and when you start with what you can do about impacts, which is called adaptation and resilience, then you start to get into a conversation which is a bit more inclusive and less polarized. And by the way, polling evidence shows very clearly that conservative-minded people and Republicans are much more open to a conversation around adaptation than they are to a conversation around decarbonization. Everybody knows, basically, that it is happening. Everybody knows we've got to do something about it to protect ourselves. And that's where we start in the Climate Majority Project. Let's come together and protect ourselves together in a sensible, effective, pragmatic way against this rising tide of threats. Isn't that something that people can unite around, just as we united around opposition to the threat in this country from abroad in the Second World War?
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
So have you essentially over the last few years, decade, had to really go through a program of re-education on this topic because there has been this pushback?
Well, it depends what you mean. Plain no in terms of the facts. I mean, the facts are more incontrovertible than ever.
But having to reinforce the facts because there has been this pushback.
That's right. What we have done is reassess some of the communication strategies that have been used. So the communications around net zero have been basically pretty disastrous from start to finish. For starters, this term net zero, I mean, what the hell does it mean? Right? It doesn't have any kind of intuitive meaning to anybody. People think that what the climate issue is really about is about some kind of distant target, which has got nothing to do with them, which is based on an odorless, colorless gas, which they don't really know anything about. They think it's to do with reducing their carbon footprint because that's what they've been told. They think that it's to do with a total kind of global problem, which they've got very little agency on. Now, when you recast it and say, no, let's start from impacts and what we can do about them, then you move from the global to the local. You move from the intangible to the tangible. You move from the very distant to the quite concrete. Anyone who's been flooded out in this country knows that there is a problem and that it's getting worse. Anyone who's experienced the extreme heat waves of the last few years knows that there's something weird going on. Farmers know what's happening, right? People who see spring coming earlier every year, farmers, gardeners, etc. They all know. If you watch a program like Gardener's World on the BBC, they are acknowledging now in a way they didn't a few years ago that it's part of the day-to-day reality of being a gardener in this country that we have to adapt to the climate that is changing because, exactly as the scientists predicted, we've dumped all this stuff in the atmosphere. But like I say, the point is, let's start with those impacts. Let's start with what we can do about them, really locally. And then once you start to do that, you realize actually some of this requires deeper strategic thinking. So, for example, you can't defend effectively against the rising danger of flooding by just building higher hard flood defenses where you are. Because if that's all you try to do, eventually those flood defenses are going to be overtopped or they're going to give out. And then you're going to have an actually worse situation than if you hadn't done anything at all. You have to look deeper into the causes. So what are the causes? So it's things like upland land management, right? It's things like the way that we've denatured our rivers and stopped them from being able to flow into floodplains and to have wetlands and peatlands that can absorb the floodwater. It's the way that we've paved over too much of our cities. We need to have, for example, in our front gardens, this is something simple that everybody can do who lives in a city or a town. Your front garden, either it should be a garden, or if it's not a garden, then if it is paved over, it needs to be at least porous, right? Otherwise, we get these crazy flash floods, which we're seeing more and more of in our cities. So these are kind of sensible, pragmatic things that add up to what we call strategic adaptation, right? A vision of how we adapt to the worsening climate, which is actually going to work, which is actually going to be effective. And the more you look into what a strategic adaptation approach is, the more you see that it's common sense, that it does what's good for nature, that it can be cost effective, because of course, like think of insurance companies, right? The last thing that they want is to be paying out more claims, etc., or to be losing customers because they can't take the risk of insuring them any longer. Insurance companies have a very different interest in this question to, say, fossil fuel companies.
And they're very good. They know what they're doing. There's a lot of very sensible, often quite conservative, quite nerdy people in insurance companies. We are working now with people in insurance companies in the Climate Majority Project. We're working with them to develop a series of scenarios for how we can do strategic adaptation, for how we can get the government to act sensibly to help all of us on this, including helping insurance companies, so that we have a future that we face together in which we are prepared for this rising tide of stuff. And that's the big prize, that we get to prepare together, that we get to protect ourselves together, and that we get to operate in the interests of the vast majority, actually, of businesses in our economy, starting with businesses like insurance companies who are facing an existential risk. So, insurance companies started saying some years ago, looks like we're headed towards an uninsurable world if we keep on down this track of worsening the climate threat that's facing us through inaction, etc. An uninsurable world, that's a world, firstly, with no insurance companies. So insurance companies are facing an existential threat before the rest of us are. There's all sorts of unexpected allies in this coalition that we're trying to build, unusual suspects, if you will, right? The usual suspects are the activists, maybe the left-wingers, etc. What we try to do in the Climate Majority Project is work with conservative politicians and work with insurers and work with senior corporate lawyers and work with anybody who understands that this is something which is going to, take down all of us unless we actually get sensible and pragmatic and start to figure out how to build down the threat rather than allowing it to rise. So it sounds to me that there is a two-pronged attack for this. One is, can we reduce our carbon footprint?
Yeah.
But secondly, almost an acceptance that there is this growing issue, so there needs to be a strategy for adaptation.
Yeah.
Has that changed over the years? Has adaptation become more a part of this strategy?
Oh, yes.
And is that because there's maybe some acceptance that you're not seeing the the reduction in carbon footprint that you would like to have seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big change. And Peter, it's only just getting underway, frankly. For too long, climate policy and climate politics and climate activism has been dominated by the hope, the understandable hope that I used to share, that the human race would be sensible enough to get its act together in the kind of way that Margaret Thatcher and many others called for, and act to reduce our climate risk. But I'm afraid to say we're here in 2025, and we are in very, very serious trouble. And we have now politicians in power like Trump who are frankly deliberately trying to make that trouble worse and also undercutting our ability even to understand it. You know, Trump is defunding the institutions that can, like NASA, that can understand what is going on. I mean, this is deeply crazy, deeply irrational behavior, but that's where we are. So that's the first reason why we have no alternative now but to take adaptation much more seriously. But there are other reasons, and I've been gesturing at them. So one is that adaptation, climate adaptation, just is much less polarized and much less polarizing than the discourse around net zero, etc. Another reason, which I've touched on, but let me bring it out a bit more, is this. When we engage together in climate adaptation and resilience, we are taking this question away from something which seems abstract and distant to something which is lived in here and now. When people see other people trying to build climate resilience through, for example, engaging in flood preparedness or community food growing projects or retrofit projects which reduce our household bills and reduce our energy waste and reduce our carbon emissions, you know, absolute no-brainer, completely crazy that governments haven't got massively behind it already. When people do that and when they see other people engaged in doing that, they're like, all right, so maybe this isn't something which is a sort of abstract political debate. Maybe this is a concrete reality here and now where we're preparing for something which we started to experience and which we have good reason to believe is going to get worse. It makes it real to people. And in that way, it's a sort of embodied kind of wake-up call. So what I say to any of my friends who say, Rupert, look, you and the Climate Majority Project, you're really sort of letting the side down by getting much more serious now about adaptation. Decarbonisation is really where it's at. We've still got to reduce the trouble at source. I say to them, well, yeah, I accept that. But you know what? What you've been trying to do is just not working. If we go down the track of taking adaptation seriously instead, that may be the way that we actually get to wake up a lot more people to the reality, the lived reality of this threat. And that may offer a way in which we can start to bring people together across the political spectrum, because you don't get to win on this unless you get a majority of people on side. That is why in the Climate Majority Project, we are absolutely serious about saying to conservatives, libertarians, etc., whatever your views about economics, whatever your views about social issues, whatever your views about identity politics, that's all fine. Get on board with us in the struggle to protect ourselves and our children against this growing threat. And we can worry about some of those issues later. I say to people who say to me, you know, I really care about disability rights or trans rights or whatever. Okay, fine. You know, I would like to have a world in which you can argue about those things. But you don't get to argue about those things if you're just scrabbling around in a flood for the last scraps of food or whatever it is, right? In an apocalyptic scenario, you don't get to have the luxury of being able to have all the wonderful and not so wonderful political debates that we have in our society right now. So this is an issue where we should be, and it's not really even an issue, it's much more fundamental than that. This is about whether we are prepared for the future that is coming together. And there is never a chance on something like this of getting where we need to get without a majority being on side. So that is why we cannot afford to have this polarized. That is why starting with the adaptation agenda can be, we think, quite a game changer.
Well, you can't be on board with adaptation without accepting there's a reason for adapting.
Absolutely. But what I've been saying is everybody really accepts this when it comes down to it, even Trump, right? Everybody can see that the climate is changing. There's some people who say, well, isn't it sunspots or whatever? I mean, that's
isn't
all
the climate
just
always changing, Rupert?
Well, of course, but
But that is an argument I hear regularly. The climate's always been changing.
yeah, but it's a very banal point, right? The level of change we've seen over the last 5, 10, 25 years is way, way more than what any of us have seen in our lifetimes, or in fact in the last few centuries. And it is exactly in the direction that the scientists predicted. And if you want a sort of a useful scientific measure which can be easily comprehended for the nature of the change, look at the Earth's energy imbalance. This is a graph which is not looked at often enough. So the Earth's energy imbalance, that's how much energy is being kept in by the atmosphere with more and more greenhouse gases in it relative to how much is going out into space. So 20 years ago, right, the Earth's energy imbalance was that there were about 3 Hiroshima bombs per second going off, equivalent in terms of heating effect. That's quite a lot, right? So a Hiroshima explosion, it's famously the temperature at Hiroshima was briefly higher than the surface of the sun during the Hiroshima explosion. So we had 3 Hiroshima bombs worth of additional heat being trapped in the atmosphere by the greenhouse effect 20 odd years ago. Over the last 20 years, that's leapt up to now about 11. So 11 Hiroshima bombs per second now. That's almost a quadrupling.
Here we go.
People say that, you can see the way that it's that yellow part of the graph is getting larger and larger on the right there.
Do you know what's quite interesting in this? It reminds me of there's a chart, an economics chart that you can see which shows where governments are running a surplus or a deficit.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, in the history of our lives, we used to have a period of surplus. They don't run a surplus anymore. Everything is a deficit. It's a constant deficit.
Yeah.
And it feels like this is almost
that's
in
right.
sync with this, in that there seem to be periods of
back
surplus.
in the 80s, 90s, it was like, it's kind of evening out. Sometimes the imbalance is one direction, sometimes it's the other. Now it's always one direction, and it's getting worse and worse. And the problem it oscillates up and down, but it's gone to a situation which is 3 or even 4 times as bad as it was 20, 25 years ago. Now, people sometimes say the trouble with the climate question is that it changes a bit too slowly for human beings to register psychologically. It's not like COVID, for example, which exploded over just several weeks, right? It takes years, it takes decades. But what I've just pointed out is on this crucial measure, how much additional heat is being trapped in the atmosphere. What's happened is that things have got about 3 times worse over just one generation. Now, that is actually quite a significant acceleration. That isn't too slow.
It's similar to inflation. If you have 2% inflation per year, you don't really feel it. You know it's there, you see it, but you don't really feel it. But over 50 years, that's a serious kind of erosion of your wealth.
Yeah.
But if you go to somewhere like Venezuela or Argentina during its periods of hyperinflation, they people knew there. They experienced it.
Oh yeah,
they experienced it at a rapid speed.
Yeah,
it feels like a slow inflation issue.
Yeah. What I'm getting at is it's not as slow as people sometimes make out.
Yeah,
and that is why it's very simple. That is why we're getting the crazy weather we've had over the last several years, especially the absolutely off the scale flooding and then fires, etc. But especially the flooding that we had last year. And what the Climate Change Committee in the UK has said this week is we are woefully unprepared. And what we're saying in the Climate Majority Project is surely something people should be able to agree about across the political spectrum is we ought to be prepared. We ought to be prepared for worst case possible scenarios, right? That is just being sensible. That is just a basic kind of core pragmatism. That isn't anything ideological. And if we start there, then we can get over some of the polarization that there's been around climate.
Is the short-term nature of the political cycle a major issue for this agenda, in that I think politicians tend to think in terms of 4 years, 5 year cycles. How do I win an election?
Yeah.
Well, can I win votes by having a pro-climate policy?
Yeah.
Or can I win votes because my sense from the population is that net zero is, it's not palatable for people, and if we push against it, we'll win votes. Is essentially politics the main opposing force here?
Well, there's a bunch of opposing forces. We've mentioned disinformation. We've mentioned economic pressure from nefarious economic interests. But the nature of the political process is a bit of a problem. I think we will not get sufficient political action on climate until at least two things have happened. One, and this is the most important thing, the majority of people, like I say, this is not a question where there's any possibility of a sort of elite solution. That is why for a long time I've been arguing against those climate diplomats, for example, who said, oh, well, we just need to sort this out at the international COP conferences. You're never going to get what you need to get at those conferences until you have people pressuring their politicians and their diplomats to do the right thing. And they're never going to do that until they understand the full nature of the threat. And they're never going to do that until they actually start to perceive and get real about the impacts that we're having and what we can do about them, until we start to feel our power and do something about them. So I think the most important thing in order to change politics around climate is to assemble and deepen that climate majority. There's already a majority of people who are concerned, but they're not concerned enough. They don't have a sense of their own power. They don't have a sense of this question being a question which starts from impacts and adaptation and resilience. They think it's to do, because they've been told this, they think it's to do with footprint and net zero and international conferences and so forth, right? So we're trying to make this shift into getting people to start from adaptation and impacts. And insofar as that process starts to happen, then we start to assemble and deepen a climate majority. And then politicians start to feel the pressure. What we want to see is a future in which politicians across the spectrum are running towards the climate question rather than, as some are doing at the moment, away from it, because they know that there is demand from young people, from grandparents, from business people, from basically most people to do something adequate on this question. The second thing, which is subsidiary but is also important, and you were getting at it in your question, is do we actually get far enough on this question if it is politicians who have to settle it? And I believe that politicians, obviously they have to be part of the solution, but there should be something else beyond that. What is that? I think that we actually have to directly involve citizens in this. What do I mean by that? I mean that we need to have something like a series of citizens' assemblies, of climate citizens' assemblies, including citizens' assemblies around adaptation, including citizens' assemblies around nature, and about other aspects of the polycrisis as well, by the way, which we could talk about. AI, for example, rising threat and concern, which has interesting and dangerous overlaps with climate. We need citizens' assemblies to help guide politicians through this, because it is always going to be hard for human beings to actually face up to this issue, because there are short-term incentives which are always going to be there to defect. And ultimately, the reason why we're so deeply stuck in this climate tragedy is because this is something which, in order to really get when we need to get to it, ultimately, we need to face as a world together. And that's really hard, right?
What is this AI overlap?
I'll come to that in a second, but can I say one more thing first about the citizens' assemblies? So I'm suggesting that what we actually need in order to really get where we need to get to on this is to empower citizens directly to answer some of these questions. In other words, I think that politicians should have the good sense to some extent, outsource to citizens the task of deciding what to do. You could think of it as like a citizens' jury, or what we call it is a people's plan for climate resilience. So again, starting with resilience and adaptation, starting with impacts and what to do about them. And that is a way in which to short-circuit some of the short-termism around the political process around climate. Now, to come to the AI...
Just before you do, what was that you brought up there, Connor?
It's currently only 18 staff working in the Department for Environmental and Rural Affairs.
So this is the news which is out today from the BBC about how pitifully prepared we are for the coming climate threats. And part of that pitiful level of preparedness is that there are very few people in government who are actually working on this in this country, in particular, very few who are working on adaptation. That's what that is about. Yeah.
Right. So AI.
Yeah. So this is obviously a huge question. We're going to have a whole podcast on it, but to talk specifically about the overlap. So let's start with the obvious. AI is hugely energy intensive, and that is frankly, and water intensive. That's frankly pretty worrying in the world that we're moving into. There's going to be more and more.
So this is a data center issue.
Yeah, basically. It's about training the AIs. It's about running the AIs. in the world that we're moving into, there are going to be increasing demands on our electricity supply because we're trying to decarbonize that supply, etc. Because maybe we're going to be running also programs of trying to get more food that uses a lot of electricity. There's lots of reasons why we're going to want more electricity in the future. If AI is putting a huge burden on that electricity supply, it stands to reason that that could be an issue. But it goes much beyond this. So AI is likely to accelerate the effectiveness of all sorts of business and economic process and accelerate their efficiency. Now, that sounds like a good thing, and it could be a good thing, but it's not a good thing if you don't have any kind of ceiling on the level of those economic activities. So, for example, AI could make the task of getting any remaining fossil fuel that we want to get out of the ground more efficient. Again, sounds like a good thing. But if what it actually means is we end up getting more and more fossil fuels out of the ground and burning more and more fossil fuels more cheaply, that is not a good thing for our collective future.
Is there not a counter-argument to that AI could also accelerate the ideas around more renewable energies?
Yeah. There are many potential upsides to AI. There are many potential downsides. My view is that the downsides will outweigh the upsides unless there is some kind of effective political control over what the AIs are used for. If they are simply let loose in pursuit of economic growth without any kinds of constraints on the direction of that growth, that could be quite dangerous. And then we come to the ultimate danger of AI in this field, which is AI could be used to power a great deal of disinformation around climate. So imagine, for example, AstroTurf campaigns run by with fossil fuel money or money from airlines or what have you, to try to persuade people that actually the climate change science isn't settled, that climate policy is too expensive, that adaptation is pointless, whatever it is, any of these things are possible. And AI is going to, over the next few years, make forms of disinformation possible. For example, persuaders and super persuaders, which we don't have any experience of, and we have very few defenses against. So again, there's a serious worry that unless there is some kind of effective political or governmental control over what AI is used for, it could be used for very nefarious ends, which could be very bad from a climate perspective.
So do you need your own persuaders and super persuaders within your army of?
We probably do, but what I'm worried about here, right, is a kind of arms race where what one should actually be able to have is some kind of cordon sanitaire around what is true and what is not true in this area, right? It shouldn't be the case, it seems to me, that people are allowed, for example, to train AIs and then let them loose in the world on a whole raft of false information. So imagine just kind of plugging into an AI, right, I want you to pretend that this Earth energy imbalance stuff that we've seen, for example, on the graph earlier, that none of that is happening, that actually it's all about sunspots, etc., etc. You know, produce the most compelling arguments you can on that basis. Key them into people's individual psychologies that you've found out from their Facebooks and their Google searches and whatever. And on the basis of that, with an enormous budget, persuade them that there's no problem with climate, etc., etc.
I think your issue there is policing that. Whilst it may be something that you see as a risk, I think it becomes close to impossible to police.
Well, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. What I'm saying is we are in very serious trouble if we allow AI to pollute further our information and knowledge space, and that this is one of the most precious things that we have, obviously, as human beings, some kind of shared sense of our reality and scientific and other ways of being able to show that and undergird it, etc. There ought to be, for example, a government information campaign in this country around the need to protect ourselves against the coming climate impacts and around some of the science that undergirds that. what you don't want is to have a situation where such an information campaign gets undermined by a whole series of AI super persuaders which have been trained on falsehoods about the world.
Have you played with the AI itself to ask it its thoughts on climate change? And
yeah, to some extent, sure.
Should we do it now? I'm just kind of intrigued. Hold on. I've got it here. I'll do it here because we can get it on the mic. Hi. Hello?
Hi there. How's it going?
Good. I'm with Rupert Read. You know him, right?
Absolutely, I know of him. Rupert Read is a philosopher and environmental activist who's done a lot of work on climate change and ecological philosophy. What's on your mind?
Well, I just want to know your thoughts on climate change. How serious a risk is it, and has it been caused by us humans and our actions here on planet Earth?
I think it's pretty clear that the consensus among climate scientists is that climate change is a serious and pressing risk, and that human activities like burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and industrial processes are the primary drivers. The increase in greenhouse gases has led to rising global temperatures, more extreme weather events, and other environmental changes that pose risks to ecosystems and human societies. That said, there are ongoing debates about the best ways to address the problem, how urgent the measures need to be, and what the economic and social trade-offs are. It's definitely a complex issue that requires a balanced and nuanced discussion.
I have one more question, because I need to get back to talking to Rupert. Why has there been a growing body of people, sources, who are disseminating information which challenges the accepted scientific consensus against climate change?
There are several reasons why a growing number of people and sources challenge the accepted scientific consensus on climate change. First, political polarization plays a big role. Climate change has become a highly politicized topic, with some viewing climate policies as a threat to economic freedom or national sovereignty. This has led to a rise in think tanks, media outlets, and political figures who promote skepticism. Second, there's economic interest. Some industries, particularly fossil fuel companies, have funded campaigns to cast doubt on climate science to protect their business interests. Third, public mistrust in institutions has grown. Events like the 2008 financial crisis, political scandals, and inconsistent messaging during the COVID-19 pandemic have fueled skepticism toward experts and authorities. Finally, the complexity and uncertainty inherent in climate science can be exploited. While the core science is robust, the details are complex and nuanced, which makes it easier for misinformation to spread and for people to latch onto simpler, more convenient narratives. In short, a combination of political, economic, and social factors has contributed to the rise of these dissenting voices.
Feels like some pretty good answers there.
Yep. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah. So we would hope there would be good AI as well that can...
Oh, totally. And don't get me wrong. Look, what I'm again doing here is considering the downsides and preparing for potential bad case and worst case scenarios, because that's the pragmatic thing to do.
Well, and the lobbyists have been successful.
But that's right. And a fear, a genuine fear around AI is, what if you get, I don't know, it could be somebody like Musk, right? Telling Grok to not come out with that kind of stuff that we just heard, which was, very strong and well supported, but to come out with some different story about how actually it's not really a very big deal, and anyway we're all going to go to Mars and everything's going to be fine, right?
Well, I don't think Musk would do that. Musk himself has actually been somebody who's been very good on the climate issue.
Well, he has in the past, but his record has changed for the worse over the past few years as he's tried to accommodate himself to Trump. Yeah,
okay.
he I used to argue with people who said, Musk is a climate hero, etc. He hasn't exactly become a climate zero now, but his trajectory is not very encouraging.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Well, there's influential people. I've got some names here. You'll probably know all of them. And I'm not raising their names to be critical of them. But Bjorn Lomborg, Michael Schellenberger, Steve Koonin, Alex Epstein, who I've actually interviewed. I've read his book as well. Matt Ridley, Jordan Peterson. There's a number of influential people who talk about climate change. They often say that I'm not denying that this is real and it's happening. But often they will say things like, but the impact isn't going to be as bad as we think it will be. Or something like Koonin said, the science is not settled, the models disagree with the observations. Are these people actually quite useful in that they force maybe your side, the people who are trying to campaign for a better understanding, to sharpen your tools and have better arguments? Or are they making it much harder?
I think it's a bit of both. As I suggested earlier, I think some of these people are not in good faith. I think some of them are in good faith but are seriously misinformed. I think that, of course, it can always be good to have challenges to sharpen one's arguments. But if somebody's kind of quite deeply misinformed or is, worse still, not in good faith, then it's not going to be a very productive conversation with them. Schellenberger, I think, has been pretty widely discredited. In terms of Lomborg, I think he's a very unreliable arguer. I would point us back to the basic facts of the situation, which is that we are on balance in a worse situation than most scientists thought we were going to be by now, not a better situation. Okay. So, for example, when I started giving talks about 8-9 years ago, warning about how bad the climate situation could become, there were some scientists, I mean completely mainstream scientists, who criticized me and some of my colleagues and said, you're going beyond the accepted science, and we don't like that. You should stick with what we're saying. You should stick with what the IPCC is saying. That's bad enough. Some of what's happened over the last 7, 8, 9 years has been worse than the so-called worst case predictions. For example, if you look at some of the stuff around ice melt, it's been worse than the most hardcore model suggested. You quoted Koonin saying, some of the models disagree with reality. Well, of course they do, because they disagree with each other, so some of them are bound to be wrong. What I'm saying is, if you look at the spread of the models, sometimes what's actually happened is outside that spread. Now, that should be really worrying to us. Like I say, uncertainty is not our friend here, right? In relation to uncertainty, one needs to hedge. This is something that I've long argued alongside my friend and colleague Nassim Nicholas Taleb, will be known, I'm sure, to some listeners to the podcast. And Nassim, of course, much more on the right than myself, but where he and I come together is around the profound importance of taking a fundamentally precautionary attitude to our situation in the world. Nassim and I have emphasized in the writings that we've done together that when we are ignorant of something, and we will always be living in a world that we fail to completely understand. Right? That's part of the humility of accepting that you are a human being, not a god. When we are fundamentally ignorant of some of the details of something, we need to act on the safe side in order to not be exposed to the very real downsides of getting these things wrong. And this logic applies to roulette, but it applies much more, or more strongly still, to Russian roulette. And it applies to the kind of real-world Russian roulette type situation that we face around climate, and also around pandemics, and also around AI.
It is one of the complexities, the difference between measurement and a thesis around the impact, in that measuring carbon, measuring ice melt, measuring the energy imbalance is I'm not going to say it's trivial, but it is a measurement, whereas trying to predict the outcome and the impact on society is quite difficult because we've not lived through this with the technology we have now, and yet people kind of want to know the impact. And if the thesis on what the impact would be slightly wrong, that people use it and go, oh, well, you predicted this would happen, it's not happened. Is that one of the complexities? Yeah,
absolutely. And the way around this is not to put too much store by predictions, right? It's not really about predicting, it's about modeling possibilities. It's about scenarios. We ought to spend a lot more time thinking about possible scenarios. What are the possible futures facing us? This is some of the work that we've been doing with insurers in the Climate Majority project. We need to be, because of course this is what insurers have always done. We need to be, and people in the markets for that matter, we need to be hedged against possible downside risks, including possible tail risks, possible worst case scenarios. And like I say, some of what's been happening in recent years has been outside even the worst case scenarios that have been
Is that the
predicted.
Measurement that's been outside, or the impact?
Yeah, well, both. Both. Yeah, I mean, nobody saw coming, for example, the extreme ferocity of what happened in Valencia. That kind of wasn't supposed to be possible. But yeah, so as I say...
The floods in Valencia.
Yeah, the floods in Valencia.
It felt like that was a period of... we went through a period of a number of these types of floods.
We did.
Around the world.
Yeah.
I remember specifically, wasn't at one point a third of Bangladesh underwater?
I think you're thinking of Pakistan. That was, when was that? A couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
A third of the whole country underwater. In this country, we have a substantial Pakistani diaspora. All of those people know that this thing is very real because they all have relatives, close or distant relatives, who've experienced it. Like I say, it's not about prediction. It's about hedging and protecting ourselves. It's about how do we put ourselves in a position where we are much less likely to have to turn around to our children or grandchildren and say, I'm sorry that we didn't take enough precautions. I'm sorry that we didn't do a good enough job of protecting ourselves, not against what we knew was coming, but what we knew could be coming.
Before I move on, because I do want to move on to the net zero topic, but before we move on to that, if you had to list 2 or 3 specific scientific measurements, the ones that you look at that concern you the most, as a kind of as a measurement that you can point people to, that things that we should be concerned about, what are the main measures that somebody like you would look at?
Yeah. So one of them we've already looked at, which is the Earth's energy imbalance. This is, I think, a much more, frankly, interesting and important measure than the one that we more commonly talk about, which is global average temperature increase.
By the way, sorry to interrupt you, but on that energy imbalance, we did see there were the peaks and the troughs.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if you can bring it up quickly, Con, but there was one moment where it looked like it came back to the line. But is there anything in that gives you hope that if we made certain changes, we could get the energy imbalance better?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course. Look, this question, this awful threat is to some extent, obviously, under our control, right? If we, in terms of the Earth's energy imbalance, it does come down to the amount of, primarily to the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And over time, we could control that. That's ultimately what we need to do. At the end of the day, that's what we have to come back to. So that's one thing. Something else I'm going to mention, which is maybe not exactly what you were asking for, because it's in the vicinity of kind of impacts rather than measurements. But I think we ought to be deeply concerned about our situation in terms of food supplies, food security. There have been some really interesting and concerning reports recently, including one by Tim Lang, who's a very mainstream food expert, suggesting that in this country in particular, but it's a global problem to a significant extent, in this country in particular, we are not prepared for the way in which climatic threats and other kinds of impacts, for example, from war, think of the Ukraine crisis, which of course has had very serious effects on the food supplies, for example, to Middle Eastern countries, that we are not well prepared for the threats that are coming down the pike to us in terms of food. And the situation in terms of the climate-food link is very concerning. In this country, we provide about 60% of our food intake, which is not a sensible position to be in as we go into the times that we're going into. How do we change that? There's a bunch of things that we need to do. We need to reduce food waste. We need to eat lower on the food chain on balance. We need to reduce the crippling monopolistic or oligopolistic power of the big supermarkets. Arguably a freer market in food would be better than what we have. I mean, either need a
More
free
localism.
market. Yeah, well, that's what I think we should have, is a lot more localism, a lot more local resilience in food supply, a lot more people involved in growing food in their local community, including in their back gardens. I have a third of an acre. We grow about 25% of our own food now. Doesn't mean we're self-sufficient. We're not living the good life, but it doesn't mean we've got a little buffer there. And if anything goes wrong in the future, it also means, of course, we get loads of very cheap, hyper-local, very high-quality organic food that we have the satisfaction of having grown ourselves. There's lots of win-wins.
I think there's a meeting of the libertarians and and yourselves here.
Absolutely, yeah. To a lot of the people who are thinking about doing some prepping, because more and more people are thinking about this,
We spoke about this the other night.
Good. People should speak about it more, because it's one way in which we make this thing real to ourselves. People who are thinking of doing a bit of prepping, I would say, yeah, go for it, definitely. Try and think about it in a way which is not too hyper-defensive. Try to think about it in a way which involves rather than excludes your neighbors. You don't really want to be in a situation where if we are in a crisis, you're having to decide whether or not to share any of the food that you have and your neighbors don't have with them. What you really want is for them to be prepping as well. The best kind of prepping is collective prepping and ultimately national prepping, right? You could think of national resilience, which is what we're calling for in the Climate Majority Project, a national resilience plan. You could think of that as kind of prepping on the national level.
My
right?
plan for a bunker and a shotgun wasn't what you were thinking.
No, so by all means, think about self-defense. That's totally legit. What I'm saying is, don't only think about that.
I know, yeah.
Think about how to make this something which is going to be more of a win-win for you and those who are around you, because you don't want to face a situation where you're going to be confronted with somebody who wants some of your food. You want them to have food that they can get for themselves too. So we need to reduce the monopolistic power of the supermarkets. We need to reduce the regulations, the crazy regulations around what is permitted as food for human consumption in this country. There are really tight restrictions, for example, on the kind of grain which is approved for entering into the food chain. Those regulations should be loosened. It would be the only people who would suffer would be the supermarkets would have to do a little bit more work, for example, on adjusting the machines that they use to process these grains. Right?
Does the regulations come from their own lobbying?
Yeah, this is stuff which comes from within the supermarket lobby, which is basically in no one's interest except for the very short-term interest of the supermarkets. So there's a bunch of things that need to be done, but ultimately, if we are going to have food security, we need to do climate resilience building, and we need to do decarbonization. We need to reduce the way in which the trouble is getting worse year on year on year until we reduce the root cause of the threat. Because we are moving into a situation, this is what Tim Lang and others have argued, in which we face the risk of what is called multi-breadbasket failure. And that means when the breadbaskets of the world go down simultaneously, each year we become a little bit more vulnerable to that threat as we move into climatic terra incognita. So it's the same as what we were saying before. We need a sensible range of pragmatic policies. We need to adapt and we need to decarbonize ultimately. If we do all those things, then we start to become safer and we start to become better off. I mean, better off in the sense of having healthier lives, having healthier food, knowing our neighbors more, etc., etc. Yeah, I believe that a big part of the future is in a sort of climate-aware relocalization.
It's funny, the more I talk to you, the more I realize that there is actually some strong alignment between the things that you want to see happen here in, say, in the UK and a number of the conservatives I speak to.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
That is an impact and hard to measure. I do want to push you just back on you had the energy imbalance. Are there other measures that you look at specifically?
Well, temperature is worth looking at. What you need to be aware in relation to temperature is that there are a number of factors affecting it. Crucially, for example, the amount of what are called aerosols in the atmosphere affects it. So this is basically pollution, or in the future, we could introduce aerosols into the atmosphere artificially to try to control the global heating that's going on. That's called geoengineering. I think that's a really terrible idea because it's really risky.
Yep.
Nassim Taleb agrees with me on this, but there's a live debate that's happening around this, and people are going to be tempted to go for geoengineering as our climate trouble becomes worse.
Well, it's easy. We tend to do that as humans.
That's right.
It's like it's like a Ozempic for the atmosphere.
Yeah, but it's not a real fix for numerous reasons we could talk about. Let me just mention one. Much earlier in this conversation, we talked about the way in which we might inadvertently, in a deep paradox or irony, end up reducing drastically the temperatures in this country because of the ice melt disrupting the Gulf Stream. So now imagine a world in which the world is getting hotter and hotter, but around the North Atlantic, temperatures are plunging downwards. Now in that world, people in a lot of the world, Africa, Asia, Australia, etc., are going to be saying, for God's sake, can't we do geoengineering? Can't we turn down the planetary thermostat, which is, of course, a pretty stupid metaphor, but that's the metaphor people want to reach for. So say we did that, right? Say we tried to geoengineer the atmosphere, put a load of aerosols into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of sunlight coming through and lowered the global temperature. You see where I'm going with this?
It's going to make us even colder.
Make us even colder, right? So these simple kind of crude shortcuts probably are not going to work, or at least they're not going to work for all of us. So, yeah. The global temperature is an important measure. It's leapt up over the last year or two in a way which has alarmed, frankly, scientists are, I'm going to use a technical term here. They're shit scared about it.
And it seems like every year on the news it says we set record global average temperatures.
Yeah, but look at that sudden leap from 2 years ago. The biggest ever single year leap that we had. Now, why was that? Well, we don't really know, but the best available theory suggests that is, to a considerable degree, a result of a reduction in the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, as a result of regulations coming in to reduce the pollution that shipping is allowed to emit. Extraordinary that it could have that strong an effect, but that's what the best science seems to be showing.
So hold on. So a policy that is designed around the environment has made us hotter.
Yeah, that's right. Now, some people say, well, shouldn't we just kind of reverse the shipping regulations? But it's not really clear that that's a very good idea either, right? Basically, the situation that we're in is that the global temperature, the sort of underlying global temperature, is probably even worse than that graph shows. It's partly being shielded from us by the level of pollution in the atmosphere, which is stopping some of the sunlight from coming through. Now, ultimately, we need to get rid of that pollution because pollution is killing people, etc. And we need to know where we're really at, right? You see what I'm getting at? It's not, if you keep polluting and allowing shipping to produce lots of crap that it puts into the atmosphere, sulfur, etc., you're not really helping us alter the fundamental climatic situation that we're in, the fundamental underlying drivers. I say that in a way it's a good thing that we now know just how bad the climatic situation is because we've removed this shipping pollution. That makes it more clear to us that, well, everyone except Trump et al., that we have to act.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about net zero. Just broadly, what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
Rather than your...
Well, like I said earlier, kind of not a lot. Does it mean a lot to anybody? So let's try to unpack
it feels
term.
Like a target.
Yeah, so it's a target. So the idea is that we should ultimately move to a situation in which we don't continue to put climate dangerous emissions into the atmosphere. So zero emissions should be the ultimate objective of global policy, which makes a lot of sense. The net in net zero means, well, it could be okay to continue to have some carbon emissions going in and heating up the atmosphere if we've got some other way of pulling them out of the atmosphere, which means that the net level is at zero. Now, one of the dangers of this net thing is it could become an excuse for bad behavior. So you've got quite a lot of companies that have been saying, oh, we're going net zero. We're continuing to throw lots of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, but we're doing this other thing to compensate.
Planting trees.
The most famous thing being planting trees. There are a number of issues with that. I'm going to mention one, which is kind of tragic and an increasing problem. And it's this. You remember the big wildfires, the horrendous wildfires in California a couple of years ago? Well, guess where Microsoft, for example, had most of their trees planted to offset their emissions? That's right. in California. Loads of their plantations, they all burnt down. And we are moving into a world, I'm sorry to have to say it, but we all know it's true, in which the risks of wildfires are going up and up. They're going to go up and up until we get the climate situation under control. So, of course, we should be planting more trees. At least we should be planting more trees in areas where there are naturally trees existing. And it's not necessarily always a good idea to plant trees just sort of at random in plantations. But of course, we should be planting more trees in nature-sensitive ways, right? Of course, we should be trying to restore nature. Of course, it makes sense to pull down some of the carbon emissions into those trees. But you cannot rely on that as a solution in a world that is more and more vulnerable to fires, as we are, for example, in this country too. We're woefully underprepared in the UK for the rising wildfire threat. We think a lot about flooding in this country because we think of ourselves as a kind of wet country. We are going to be exposed to wildfire risk in the next 5 to 10 years like we've never had before. Anyway, you see the point. The point is, if you rely on offset type solutions, if you rely on the net in net zero, you might be banking on a false paradise. So that's one of the issues with net zero.
So are you yourself against the concept of net zero?
I'm not necessarily against the concept of it. I think that the implementation of it has been highly problematic. I think it was never a sensible thing to sort of put front and center in communications around this. I think what we should have done is what we were talking about an hour ago. What we should have said to people is, look, you can start to see, and this has been possible for the last several years now, since about 2016, the world's climate has been starting to spin somewhat out of control, and we've now had about 9 years of that. What we should have done is said to people, you can see, right? Farmers can see, gardeners can see, anybody who's got open eyes, even Trump with his golf courses can see, that we're getting into a dangerous situation here. Let's start by thinking about how we adapt to that. Okay, and when you start to think about that seriously, you realize we have to adapt strategically. And when you actually ultimately take strategic adaptation seriously, you still realize that there are limits to adaptation. If the temperature goes up and up and up and up, eventually there'll come a point where we can't cope anymore. So, for example, we can adapt really effectively by greening our cities. It is phenomenal. Anyone who's been in a city street with lovely, tree-lined street, as opposed to a street where you just got bare asphalt. It's phenomenal the difference that makes. It can make a difference of 5 degrees centigrade, 10 degrees centigrade, 12 degrees centigrade, way more than the amount of overheating that we're getting. So if we green...
Hold on, there's some big temperature changes you've just said.
Yeah, massive. But I'm talking about local temperature changes. Yeah.
Okay.
So by greening our cities, we can make them far more livable. By the way, this is something which it makes total sense for people in the global north to be funding in the global south. I bet that some of your listeners are very concerned about high levels of migration to the global north. One of the absolute no-brainers here is, why don't we help people have livable lives in the global south by giving them a bit of money to green their cities, to have these enormous reductions in temperature, and then those people will be much less likely to want to make difficult journeys across seas, etc., because their lives are becoming intolerable. Anyway, that's kind of an aside.
I mean, look, you've definitely hit on a topic that's probably relevant to a lot of the listeners, but I don't think those people are leaving because of temperature reasons at the moment. They may in the future.
But some of them, seriously, some of them are. Like some people in Africa are. There are places in Africa and India which are getting to the edge of livability now. And some of those places are places where, they've stripped out all their trees. If they had help restoring trees and parklands and wetlands and so forth, it could be a very different place to live in. Obviously, it's not the only factor, but it is already a factor, and it's going to become an increasingly big factor. Anyway, that's really an aside. The point was, greening cities is a brilliant adaptation solution. But say you reduce the temperature, the ambient temperature in your city by 6 degrees by greening it. Well, if we have an urban heat island effects and let's imagine runaway climate effects which could occur, and we start to get 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees temperature of global overheat, eventually we get to a situation where it's unadaptable. So sooner or later, even when you engage in the best strategic adaptation, you realize, you know what? The ultimate strategic adaptation is to live in a way which is more in harmony with the basic rhythms this planet, and that means not endlessly bunging more and more carbon up into our atmosphere. So you take people on this journey through the different forms of adaptation to realizing ultimately, look, we need to protect ourselves against what's here and against what's coming in a way which makes ultimate sense from a precautionary point of view as well as a scientific point of view. We need, at the end of the day, we do need to decarbonize. That's the way we should have gone. Not said to people, here is this kind of abstract idea of net zero. That is something which obviously we all have to aim at, and whether or not it has harmful economic consequences, right? Instead, we ought to have been looking for win-wins. Like I said earlier, for example, retrofit, right? Why haven't governments like the UK government put enormous resources into reducing people's heating bills, reducing energy waste, reducing carbon emissions by stopping heating the sky? Did you know that 30% of buildings in this country have zero, not insufficient, zero loft insulation? It's just completely insane. A lot of those buildings are rented, so no one's got an immediate economic incentive to put the insulation in. There are very real win-wins here. We've talked about a number of them in this conversation. Those need to be the basis for what we do, not a sort of ideological commitment to the truth of the aim of so-called net zero.
So my house is a fairly new build. It's 3.5 years old, and it has incredible insulation. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But it's become almost unlivable in the summers to the point that now I need some form of air conditioning. Just like it's a funny impact of the great insulation we have.
So obviously I don't know about the details of your house, but if you get your houses insulated in a really smart way, it can protect you against heat in summer as well. Because, of course, one of the things that happens in summer in some houses is that the heat basically comes straight through the roof into the dwelling. There are ways of doing insulation smartly so that it works in both winter and summer.
It definitely wasn't done smart.
No, definitely not. Yeah, we've got issues with the guy who built our house. Okay.
Can I just pitch in real quick?
Yeah.
This is a global issue, right?
Yeah.
It's all well and good putting all this restrictions and money in the UK. But when you've got China still contributing, I think, 30% of global emissions, and they're not stopping, they're not slowing down, they're actually just speeding up.
Well, that's not clear. They are putting in a huge amount of renewable energy. It's true they're continuing to build coal-fired power plants, which is bad. But a lot of those coal-fired power plants are being built in a way such that they may be used as backup rather than baseload. Some of them may never even really actually be used in a substantive way. So look, you're absolutely right.
Can I just add some context to Colin's question? Because I think he's made an interesting point that does come up. In that, I think we are responsible, the UK is 1% of global emissions, but currently our energy prices are, I think, the highest in Europe and one of the highest in the world. And we do know that energy costs are a key driver of economic activity.
Yeah.
There are businesses that have closed because their energy costs are too high. That balance of trying to keep energy costs low, but at the same time trying to...
and what's the cheapest form of energy in this country now?
I'm assuming you may bring up wind.
Wind is the cheapest.
Is that unsubsidized?
Oh yeah, I mean, wind is now economic without subsidies.
Okay,
it's miles cheaper than nuclear, but it's also cheaper than fossil energy.
But we can't rely on it alone, right? We have to have an energy mix.
We have to have an energy mix, although increasingly that mix can be a mix of different renewable energies, wind and solar and tidal. Plus, of course, storage. Storage is becoming more and more possible. Battery storage, of course, becoming more and more possible. There are also things coming online like gravity storage. We should have a lot more gravity storage in this country. Gravity storage is incredibly simple. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it, but the classic example is there is a reservoir in Wales where when there is a lot of energy available, they pump water uphill. And when there's an energy shortage, the water comes downhill and runs a turbine.
That is amazing.
This makes such simple sense.
I love that.
There should be more of that, right? So if we have more storage, and if we have a mixed basket of renewables, then we reduce the amount of baseload that we need. But let's take
But why is energy so expensive in the UK?
It's a great question, and the main element of the answer is that the energy companies are basically scamming us.
Is that true? Is
Yeah,
that really true?
There's lots of good evidence to support that. That's why it's different in this country to other European countries, because there are other European countries who, like us, have got good wind and solar resources. That's not the cause of the problem. It's basically the energy companies are scamming us. Plus, we have a very inefficient system in this country. So let's go back to housing.
Sorry,
our housing stock is unusually...
Sorry, can you try and fact check that? And even if you have to use AI, but can you just try and ask why? I
could share a good link with you on that
please
after
do,
this.
Yeah, just ask where we rank in Europe in terms of energy prices, and then try and ask the reason why. I have actually started to trust the AI on the answers a bit more. I mean, I thought that answer earlier was pretty much what we were speaking about.
Yeah, it was. It was almost as if it had been listening.
Yeah, maybe it has been.
The other element of why our energy prices are so high in this country, which really needs to be taken into account, is that our housing stock, for example, is unusually inefficient by European standards. So if we did the kind of things that I've been talking about, these win-win-wins of transformative and strategic adaptation, of building resilience by retrofit, etc.
Hold on, that would answer why our overall bills are higher. But what we're paying for kilowatt, the opposite should be true, because if there's higher demand, then prices should come down.
Well, yeah, but of course we don't have a genuine energy market in this country. Once again, we've got a kind of worst of all worlds situation here, right? It would arguably be better than what we currently have to have a more genuinely open energy market.
It's the libertarian in you coming out again. You want a free market?
Yeah. So what I actually think we should have is a situation in which people are. It's far easier for people to engage in producing their own energy and in saving their own energy. So we have a pitifully small amount of community energy in this country. There should be loads of people who have community-owned wind turbines and community-owned water turbines and community-owned local solar farms. So some people get up in arms against solar farms in this country. And one of the reasons they do is they don't see the benefit. Right? And why should local people not feel the benefit when massive amounts of solar is installed locally? They should feel the benefit. And that, again, is basically about corporate scalping and bad regulations.
Well, I think there's been some arguments from farmers about covering farmland with large amounts of solar panels, and also the full economic picture of solar, in that a lot of the materials for building a solar farm are built in China and shipped here. There's a lot of e-waste that comes with it. I think there's like a wider argument. It's a
complicated picture, but can I just recomplicate it a little bit more by saying we are probably headed into a future where, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe a lot longer, we're going to continue to get hotter summers in this country. Like right now, for example, I mentioned to you earlier, our tiny holding, that's what we call it, our third of an acre in rural Norfolk. It's very dry. Right, and we've got a forecast of weeks and weeks of sun. Spring is supposed to be a wet time in this country. In the future that we're moving into, of probably hotter conditions, at least for a good while, 40-degree summers, maybe hotter than that. There may come a time, and some farmers say that we're already in that time, where what they actually need is a certain degree of protection, shade protection, in their fields in order to grow crops well, so their crops don't get basically roasted in the field. You see where I'm going with this? It's called agrovoltaics. There are ways now of integrating solar panels with farming, such that you can appropriately shade parts of the field in order not just to be able to grow crops, but to grow them better than if the panels weren't there.
So on this podcast, you are definitely hearing me talk about Bitcoin a lot. Well, why? We live in a really strange time with governments driving inflation with their reckless spending and endless money printing. There is a way out of this. There is a way to protect your money, and that is by stacking Bitcoin. I've made loads of shows about Bitcoin. You can go and research this, you can go and read the books, but the truth is, it is the hardest money ever created. If you are interested in protecting your financial future, it's time for you to get on the Bitcoin train. I've been stacking Bitcoin personally and through my businesses since 2017. It's protected me, it's secured my family's future, and it also strengthens all of my businesses. So if you want to start stacking Bitcoin, where do you do it? Well, for me, it's with Gemini. They're a fully licensed, full reserve exchange and custodian, So they give you a secure way for you to buy and own your Bitcoin. There's no risks and no funny business. So if you're serious about stacking Bitcoin the right way, head over to Gemini.com, which is GEMINI.com. It's another fascinating adaptation. Okay, so UK energy prices remain high in 2021. Okay, what's your summary?
Give it an overview?
Yeah.
It's basically importations of gases, taxes on
high gas prices,
on the imported gases.
Well, but go back. We will rely on imported gas because you can't. Well,
we'll rely on it less and less the more we do the stuff that I've been talking about.
But we couldn't only have solar panels and wind energy because there are times when the wind isn't windy and the sun isn't shining. So you have to have.
Well, it depends on the timescale you're talking about, right? What we need is a program. To be fair to Labour, they're trying to move in this direction. We could talk about some of the ways in which they're not doing that effectively or indeed fast enough. But what we need is a program for getting us into a situation whereby in about 15 years' time, our reliance on fossil fuels is negligible. And that is entirely possible if we move to a mixed basket of renewables. If we take tidal power seriously, for example, beautiful thing about tidal power, it's absolutely 100% reliable. You can predict it, decades ahead. If we bring in gravity solutions quite heavily, if we increase the amount of battery power that we have in this country to tide over those low periods.
I think you would always need something like gas.
Well, but there's a lot of scientists and engineers who increasingly would disagree with that assessment.
I think that one's the most interesting.
Energy bills in the UK also include costs of grid maintenance, infrastructure upgrades, and policy-driven charges such as renewable energy subsidies.
Which, of course, are really small compared to fossil fuel subsidies, let alone nuclear subsidies.
Can you scroll up a section to kind of reduce renewable energy? Periods of low wind and outages at nuclear stations have decreased renewable energy generation, increasing reliance on gas. So there is that reliance on gas-fired power plants because the network relies on it.
Yeah,
and we're having to import that, which is expensive.
And what you could also have, by the way, if you need a small amount of kind of on tap energy from burning, that could be based, if it's a small amount, that could be based on sustainable biomass. A lot of the biomass we're burning at the moment is not at all sustainable. It's awful. We're taking down wonderful old growth forests, etc. But there is, some market for genuine, tree waste and so on and so forth. You could have a few kind of biomass power stations where you could quickly switch them on and move into a burn. That kind of technology is increasingly becoming available. By the way, something which was mentioned up there, which is quite important, is that some of your listeners may be fans of nuclear power. One reason for being suspicious of some of the claims that are made around nuclear is not just that it's unbelievably expensive and that you don't get any of it coming on stream without massive government subsidies. There's been there's been a significantly deregulated energy market in this country now for about 20 years. In theory, it's possible for anyone to just go ahead and build a nuclear power plant. They will not do it without the government teat. Right. But the point I wanted to make was another different one, which was on there, which was people say nuclear is very reliable, but nuclear has unplanned, massive long outages of power on a periodic kind of basis. On that kind of measure, nuclear can be actually less reliable than renewables.
But would you agree that nuclear is essentially a green energy?
Not really, no.
Because of waste?
Well, I think that the waste issue is fundamental. Here's one way of thinking about why it's fundamental. Tragically, we are moving into a future in which we cannot guarantee the continuation of anything like civilization as usual, right? People know this. Governments know this. They don't talk about it very much, but I talk about it with civil servants and scientists and politicians and so on behind the scenes, people in military, intelligence, etc. Ordinary citizens know it. If you ask people in a poll, do you think we're still going to have a functional civilization that looks anything like this one by the end of the century? Huge pluralities or even majorities of people say they suspect that we don't. The bottom line is that we don't know the future, but we do know that there is a possibility that this civilization is not going to persist. Now, in that future, what you do not want is stuff that is highly damaging to people who are no longer in a situation to be able to control it. So there are certain kinds of chemical plants and nuclear power plants which are extremely hazardous to have around in a situation where civilization may be going into, well, to coin a phrase, meltdown. I think it is deeply irresponsible to pump out more nuclear waste into a world where we do not know that we're going to continue to be able to guard it effectively against sea level rise, against non-state terrorists, or simply against decay and spontaneous fires, etc.
But we already then have that issue because we already have.
We do, yeah.
So we already have nuclear waste.
Yeah. But we shouldn't carry on making it worse.
But if we already have it, the marginal risk of adding more nuclear
No, I
waste.
don't think that's a very strong. I don't think our children or grandchildren will be very impressed by that argument. So you thought we've already created a bad situation, so there's no real reason not to make it worse. I don't think that's a very strong argument.
But how much worse does an additional amount of nuclear waste make the situation if we already have a process for storing it and guarding it? We know the amount of waste is quite small.
Well, yeah, but some of it is very highly toxic.
See, this is where I'm empathetic to most of the things you said, and I'm certainly not somebody who's a climate denier or somebody who would campaign against it. But I always find the nuclear argument. I always struggle with that argument because I do think one of the biggest costs of nuclear is the regulatory environment. The huge cost is the regulatory environment, and I do think it's relatively a green energy.
Well, look, it's relatively green in terms of carbon emissions at point of power generation. You've got to take into account the entire supply chain, and you've got to take into account the entire waste monitoring chain.
But don't you have to consider the entire supply chain for wind and solar too?
Of course you do, yeah. But those are comparatively lower. Those calculations have been done by what's his name, Hiten Keshi, for example. They're comparatively lower. But what I was getting at was the entire waste chain. If you go nuclear, you have to guard that waste for essentially, thousands of years, and you have to guard it really, really carefully for hundreds of years. That's quite a significant further burden, which is never usually taken into account in these calculations. But there's another point here. Even if it turns out that nuclear is low carbon, the argument I've been making a minute ago is that I don't believe that it is a precautionary thing to do at this time. When we are facing potential civilizational collapse, we shouldn't engage in very high risk chemical production. We shouldn't engage in very high risk nuclear production. And by the way, we shouldn't engage in very high risk geoengineering, because this is a very important point, which again, listeners might not have considered against the advocates of geoengineering, throwing lots of new particles into space or whatever, mirrors in space. If you start geoengineering, like we kind of saw with the temperature graph and the suggestion that it's actually the reduction of shipping pollution, which has probably led to that jump. If you start geoengineering, you can probably basically never stop. And if you do stop suddenly, you get what is called termination shock. You get a disastrous, sudden jump in temperature, which is really unadaptable for humans, let alone other animals. So that means you probably have to continue geoengineering forever. But if you get a civilizational collapse, well, then you can't continue it. So one of my arguments against geoengineering is, in a world where tragically we can no longer rule out that our descendants may have to endure a civilizational collapse, it would be very unjust to throw them into that situation and have them subject to termination shock as well.
I think many people fear geoengineering and playing God and the unknown consequences of it. Connor, can you go back to, independent analysis of the carbon emissions associated with nuclear plants have demonstrated they have a smaller lifetime greenhouse gas footprint than that created by solar and power, about the same as wind power. The International Panel on Climate Change classified energy sources that produce 12 grams of CO2, which is about the global average for nuclear's life cycle. But that's not really your argument anyway. Yours is the...
Yeah.
But civilizational collapses, that's an interesting one to have as your argument against it. Con, can you just go back to that chat thing and just ask, I'd be intrigued to know what percentage of our energy bill is taxation? And where do we compare to Europe? Because it seems to me a lot of this is taxation.
Is what?
Of our energy prices is tax. It'd be interesting to know. In the UK, tax and levies constitute a significant proportion of your energy, but here's a breakdown. VAT, yeah. So domestic energy charged at a reduced rate of 5%. Green levies, climate change levy. So for households, taxes and levies can comprise approximately 20 to 25% of the total energy bill. Can you ask it to compare that to the rest of Europe? I'm just intrigued to know. I bet it's probably quite similar. It's very similar. 24.3% across Europe. Yeah, interesting. Because I thought it may be higher because of that. Okay, can we talk about Extinction Rebellion? Because I would say, even if I disagree with some of their campaigns and their strategy, they've certainly been effective at raising awareness.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they've been effective at onboarding people onto their mission.
Right, agreed.
What is your connection with Extinction Rebellion?
So back in 2018, I was making these warnings about how bad the climate situation was looking. And like I say, I'm sorry to say that those warnings have been vindicated. And my attention was drawn to a small group of people who were putting together this thing called Extinction Rebellion, who were saying the same kind of thing as me, but they had a plan on what to do about it. So I got involved and helped Extinction Rebellion launch, and I was part of XR for 2 years, and I'm quite proud of that period. I think we really did achieve something then, in particular in April 2019, when we had the first Extinction Rebellion and achieved national and indeed worldwide attention and forced a national conversation about this and about how serious the hazards were. And as a result of that, we got to have the parliamentary declaration of climate and environment emergency. We got to have the parliamentary assembly on climate. And we got to have the world's first climate net zero law. But the progress didn't continue, and not very much actually changed in terms of policy. In late 2019, I started to conclude, along with quite a lot of other people, that XR had probably accomplished as much as it was able to do. And if it carried on doing the same thing, it would start to be counterproductive. And XR also made one or two mistakes, such as the infamous episode of a few rebels standing on a tube train and stopping it from running, which nobody understood. You know, one of the elementary rules of protest, I think, is you have to do protest that people can understand. They have to make sense to people.
I think
that rule got violated.
Some of the campaigns or the disruptions within museums throwing.
Okay, so now just to make a technical point, that of course wasn't Extinction Rebellion.
Oh, is that?
We're talking now about Just Stop Oil, and Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain have gone a lot further than Extinction Rebellion did. And my judgment is that what they've done has not been helpful.
Counterproductive.
So yeah, exactly.
But do you agree with the right to protest?
Of course.
And when do you think it crosses a line that should become
we should all be very concerned about the pretty draconian anti-protest laws that have been brought in the last few years. Anyone who believes in liberty should be concerned about those laws. So XR did something really important in 2019, and I was proud to be a part of that. But in 2020, along with quite a lot of others, I moved on and said, look, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, actually, they're sort of doubling down on what XR has done, and they're not helping. In fact, they're making things worse. What we actually need to do is move, if you will, in the opposite direction, because people's concern now has been activated. A lot of people are concerned. That's very clear in opinion polls in this country and around the world. What they want to know is what they can do, how they can help, along with other people, what they can do which is actually meaningful. And that's what we try to offer in the Climate Majority Project. So back in 2020, I started trying to create the conditions for this. I started noticing that people were spontaneously producing organizations which were building this new, as we called it, moderate flank in climate and nature action. They were doing things like, for example, creating Lawyers for Net Zero, which is now called General Counsel Sustainability Forum. This is corporate lawyers, so not your usual climate activist type characters. This is corporate lawyers who are trying to act through their corporations to do the right thing on climate adaptation and climate decarbonization. And I noticed that there were people engaged in sort of climate-aware rewilding, and we noticed that there were people engaging in local community climate action and adaptation, etc. Something is happening here. Stuff is starting to bubble up. What an awful lot of people now want to know is, how can I contribute in a way which just goes beyond my vote or goes beyond my own personal action in a way which can be meaningful? And so we work with artists, we work with insurers, we work with lawyers, we work with people in the civil service and politicians, and we work with just citizens at large, because if you're not sure what to do, it's quite likely that the most effective thing that you can do is join with others in engaging in community resilience building or community adaptation type stuff, of the stuff we talked around earlier in the podcast. Everybody who engages in flood awareness building or preparedness, or seeking to grow more food in their local area in a way which is a bit more robust against climate and a bit less damaging to the land, or who engages in community energy generation, or who engages in community retrofit programs, because of course the most effective way of insulating a street is not to do it sort of in a kind of patchwork, to do the whole street at once. That's what ought to be happening a lot more than it is. And in the absence of government doing that, people are trying to do that locally. For example, one of our collaborators is called Retrofit Balsall Heath, quite poor area of Birmingham, quite ethnically diverse. They're getting community retrofit happening in such that there are 1 or 2 houses there now which require basically no energy. They are zero energy houses throughout the vast majority of the year. All they need is a bit of wood burning in the middle of winter. So if you're not sure, if you're a listener and you're like, well, yeah, so I'm kind of getting this, and wherever I stand on the political spectrum, whether I'm a conservative or a socialist or anywhere in between, I kind of think I actually want to do more of this. And you're not sure how to get involved, you could obviously go on our website, climatemajorityproject.com, but it may well be that the way that makes sense for you to get involved in this is by raising awareness and by actively contributing along with others, and by actively protecting yourself and those you love by engaging in one of these many forms of community adaptation.
Can we afford as a country to make big changes, the kind of big changes that you would like to see? Because we are in a tough economic environment. We've been through a period of high inflation. I think people are feeling the pinch.
Yeah.
I know businesses are finding it hard. A lot of small businesses are finding it hard. A large percentage of their costs, again, are energy costs.
Yeah.
How do we as a country afford to put in place the kind of policies that you would like to see without harming our economy? Or is that not possible? Do we have to choose?
So I think we can, but let me start out by doing something different, by kind of turning the question around. Can we afford not to?
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that, yeah.
So, and let's start again with climate protection, with climate adaptation, with climate resilience, right? Can we afford not to take these kind of measures? Let's look, for example, at what this government is trying to do. So they're trying to electrify the energy supply in this country more and make more of it based on renewable energy. I think that's a good thing. I think it's pretty obvious that that's a good thing. Some listeners might disagree. But whatever you think about, whatever energy infrastructure you have, right, whether it's based on renewables or fossil fuels or anything, it needs to be itself resilient against shocks, right? It needs to be itself something you can rely on. Otherwise, you get what's just happened in Portugal and Spain. We don't know exactly what has happened. Yeah. Seems to be some evidence that it's climate fluctuation related. Anyway, whatever is the cause of it, you don't want that sort of thing to happen. How do we reach a situation where our energy generation and energy distribution systems are less rather than more vulnerable? We've got to create climate resilience. What does that mean? So here's one of the things it means. It means that we've got to be less immune to storms Here's another thing that it means. We need to be not less immune, less vulnerable to storms. Here's another thing that it means. It means that we have to be less vulnerable to temperature increases, to overhead wires melting, etc., roads melting for that matter. Here's another thing it means. We need to be less vulnerable to temperature decreases.
Well,
Remember
what you
the
said,
thing?
yeah,
That's right. Here's a shocking fact about the national grid in this country. They have no plans for a potentially colder future. They are preparing for a hotter climate, which is what scientists have been saying is most likely. But what scientists are also saying increasingly is, but guess what? It could, in this part of the world, be the opposite. We can't tell you for sure which it's going to be because we're creating a situation of climate chaos inadvertently. The Gulf Stream might get switched off over the next decade or two. National Grid is not prepared for a colder future. We need to be prepared for a colder future. We need to be prepared for a hotter future. It sounds crazy, but that's what we need to do. It is going to be a bit expensive. But again, the cost of not doing it could be much, much higher, right? So what I say is we need something like a mission. We cannot afford not to have a mission of becoming climate resilient. You want to have a country that is protected against what is coming. You want yourself and your loved ones and your community to be protected against what is coming. You can do some of it yourselves, but you also need government to act on it. And if we have governments like this one, which are trying to do some good things, but which do not have resilience built into what they do to undergird it, it could all just come tumbling down.
We're not too late?
Oh, no, we're not. We're absolutely
we have time?
We're absolutely not too late to protect ourselves against the worst of what is coming and to start to move into a situation where we stop making the problem worse and worse forever. We are too late to stop bad impacts. We're too late to keep below what the IPCC said was the maximum threshold for a relative degree of climate safety.
Which was?
Cashes out at 1.5 degrees of average global overheat, since pre-industrial times. We're too late to have a smooth and orderly green transition. What some businesses and politicians have been saying, it's so fine, we'll just move kind of smoothly from having a fossil fuel supply energy system to having a renewable energy supply system. It's too late for that. It's not too late to protect ourselves against the worst of what is coming. It's not too late to wake ourselves and everybody else up more than we already have done so that we do actually eventually start to take the decarbonization agenda seriously. It's not too late to take the polycrisis seriously, but every day it becomes later.
Do you ever lose hope?
Well, the question is a bit of a binary one, right? So sometimes I feel a bit hopeless, but then I remind myself some things we have to relinquish, some things we have to give up hope for, the things I've just mentioned. But there are other things which we can still hope for, and that will always be the case. So what I say to people who say to me, is it too late? Or do you have hope? Is too late for what? Hope for what? Let's always be specific about it. So I retain hope that we can have a future in which, although a lot of things are frankly and honestly going to be harder, that we are going to make the best of it, like we did in the Second World War. I mean, who'd have thought in the Second World War that we'd have come out of it on the other side with a population that was in many ways healthier than the population that went into the war? Why was it healthier? Well, it was healthier because of food rationing. Why was it healthier? Because suicide rates went down in the Second World War. Why did suicide rates go down in the war? Because people had a sense of shared purpose and meaning, right? And that's actually one of the massive potential silver linings in this terrible crisis that we face. People are going to be brought together and thrown back upon their own resources, and people are going to be frankly forced to rebuild community. And a lot of the things that conservatives care about, the atomization of our world, the degradation of kind of old systems of meaning, etc. Well, yeah, some of those old systems of meaning have been degraded, but we can remake them. We can remake them, for example, through churches and religious institutions and other community institutions that exist, and new ones that we will create. We will find a great meaning in what is coming in this tremendous set of threats that are bearing down on us. Well, let's put it this way. Either we will find that great meaning or we will collapse.
And to the biggest skeptics of all, what would you say to them?
Well, to the professional skeptics, I wouldn't say anything.
Well, you can't help those.
But
look, I think a lot of people get their opinions now from things they read, podcasts they listen to, their sources. They're not necessarily, they're going to the source material themselves, or can understand the source material. So
Sure.
those skeptics who have maybe been ideologically trapped.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if what skeptic means is someone who wants to check out carefully what they hear, well, great. Skepticism in that sense is built into the scientific endeavor. If you're someone who wants to think for yourself, fantastic. Just make sure you are thinking of yourself and you're not being duped and having a load of mental pollution, poured directly, a load of shit being poured directly into your brain without you realizing it. So what I would say to anyone who is, unconvinced and who thinks that they still want to know more is, well, by all means, keep finding out more. But think of the elementary principles of risk analysis. I mentioned Nassim Taleb earlier. Some of the most important work that I've done over the last 20 years has been the work that he and I did together around the precautionary principle, coming at it from very different starting points. But we found this profound meeting point around risk analysis. What you want to do is reduce your exposure to risk. You want to reduce your exposure to harm. You want to be ready to cope with bad case or worst case scenarios. That basically at the end of the day is common sense. That is not left or right. That is common sense. So I would say to people, don't get too hung up on exact predictions or wanting to know exactly whether the science is 100% reliable. Think about what is a sensible kind of prudent way to move into the difficult, uncertain world that is arising, to deal with hazards that are reliably growing, that you can see, that you can sense, that you basically know are there. And I would say if you approach things in that spirit of how do I become prepared for all hazards? How do I operate a kind of no regrets type policy? How do I make sure that I'm in a position to be able to say to my children or grandchildren, well, I tried along with your mum or along with my neighbors, etc., to do what could best protect you against what I saw as potentially, not certainly, but potentially coming. I think if you go down the track with that kind of mentality, then whether or not you're me or Taleb or Amber Rudd, you're going to come out with a quite similar set of policies and attitudes and practices that you take into your life.
Rupert, fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in and doing this. I've certainly learned some things today. I've got some more research to do, and maybe, hopefully, we can do this again sometime. But thank you very much for coming in and doing this with me. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I'll see you all soon.